The heat over Southeast Asia in 1972 felt heavier than usual, as if the sky itself were straining under the weight of too many secrets. The Vietnam War was grinding toward exhaustion, but the air war remained a contest of nerves, speed, and ideas. Radar scopes flickered day and night, tracking phantoms, interceptors, and ghosts that appeared at impossible altitudes. Among those ghosts was a machine American pilots spoke of in lowered voices, the MiG-25. It was supposed to be a myth. Reports from reconnaissance crews described something impossibly fast, an interceptor that climbed like a missile and vanished before escorts could react. State Route 71 crews whispered about radar spikes that followed them higher than anything had a right to go. Intelligence analysts argued over grainy signals intelligence and contradictory radar plots. Some claimed the Soviets had fielded a technological monster. Others insisted it was exaggeration, radar clutter, or pilot stress. Then, against all expectations, one appeared intact. The aircraft arrived not in Vietnam, but thousands of miles away, under a blanket of secrecy so thick that even its handlers used false names. The official explanation involved foreign material evaluation. Unofficially, everyone involved knew this was something else entirely. The jet had been diverted through a labyrinth of diplomatic favors, quiet defections, and geopolitical luck. When its crates were finally unloaded at a remote desert test facility in the American Southwest, a handful of senior officers simply stared at them in silence. Stenciled on the fuselage panels were Cyrillic warnings. The red star was crudely painted over, but its outline remained visible beneath the fresh gray coat. This was no MiG-21, no lightweight dogfighter built for knife-range combat. This machine was massive, angular, brutal. Twin engines the size of small cars sat buried deep in a stainless steel fuselage that looked more like a missile casing than an airplane. Colonel James Calder had flown fighters for nearly 20 years. Korea had been the beginning, Vietnam the middle, and now this strange assignment felt like the closing of a circle. He had test-flown experimental interceptors, chased altitude records, and survived systems failures that should have killed him. Yet when he first walked around the MiG-25, he felt something unfamiliar, unease. "This thing isn't built to turn," one engineer muttered, tapping the wing root with a knuckle. "It's built to run." Calder didn't answer. He was studying the leading edges, the riveted seams, the way the aircraft seemed indifferent to elegance. American jets tried to hide their strength behind smooth curves and layered composites. The MiG-25 made no such effort. It looked industrial, almost crude, like a tool designed to be abused. Inside the hangar, the briefing was short and unusually blunt. "This aircraft is designed to intercept at extreme altitude and speed," the intelligence officer said, flipping through slides. "Mach 2.8 sustained. Possibly higher for short periods. Service ceiling above anything we currently operate in theater." Someone laughed quietly. "That's propaganda." The officer didn't smile. "We didn't think the SA-2 envelope was real either, until it started killing people." Calder leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He had seen what happened when assumptions met reality over Hanoi. Technology had a way of humbling confidence. The colonel's orders were simple: evaluate the aircraft as a pilot, not an engineer. How it felt, what it demanded, what it forgave, and what it didn't. When he finally climbed the ladder into the cockpit, the first thing he noticed was space. Unlike the cramped MiG-21, the Foxbat's cockpit was wide, almost spacious. The second thing was heat. Even cold and unpowered, the metal seemed to radiate warmth, as if it remembered speed. The instruments were blunt and oversized. No attempt at elegance, no attempt at redundancy beyond what was absolutely necessary. Labels were stenciled in Cyrillic block letters. The radar scope dominated the panel like a single unblinking eye. Calder ran a gloved hand along the console and felt vibration dampers the size of his fist. "This thing expects violence," he murmured into his recorder. The ground crew struggled at first. Soviet engineering followed different assumptions. Panels opened in unfamiliar sequences. Systems lacked the safety interlocks American technicians relied on. Where U.S. aircraft prevented mistakes through layers of automation, the MiG simply assumed the operator knew better, or paid the price. The engine start was unlike anything Calder had experienced. The twin Tamansky engines didn't whine or ease into life. They detonated into motion, shaking the airframe hard enough to rattle teeth. Temperature gauges climbed rapidly, hovering near red lines that would have grounded any American jet. "Those numbers can't be right," a technician said over the intercom. "They are," Calder replied. "They just don't care." Taxiing was awkward. The aircraft felt heavy, reluctant to turn, as if annoyed at being asked to do anything slowly. But once lined up on the runway, something changed. The jet seemed to tense, like a predator finally released. "Cleared for takeoff," the tower said, voice tight. Calder advanced the throttles. Acceleration was not smooth, it was violent. The MiG-25 surged forward with an indifference to fuel consumption that bordered on arrogance. The runway vanished beneath him faster than expected, and the jet leapt into the sky not gracefully, but decisively. Landing gear retracted with a loud mechanical finality. Climb rate was staggering. Within minutes, Calder was above altitudes where most fighters began to feel thin and hesitant. The Foxbat did not hesitate. The controls were heavy, almost stubborn, but stable. This was not a machine that invited improvisation. It demanded obedience. At Mach 2, the aircraft felt almost comfortable. At Mach 2.5, the skin temperature warnings illuminated, then faded. The jet didn't protest. It simply continued. Calder realized, with a chill, that this interceptor was never meant to dogfight. It was meant to appear where nothing else could, deliver its missiles, and leave before the enemy understood what had happened. "This isn't an airplane," he said quietly. "It's a strategy." He imagined American reconnaissance aircraft over North Vietnam, crews relying on altitude and speed for safety. He imagined Soviet advisors watching radar screens, calculating intercept windows measured in seconds. The MiG-25 wasn't there to dominate the sky. It was there to deny it. As fuel began to drop at an alarming rate, Calder eased the throttles back. The aircraft responded reluctantly, as if offended by restraint. Descent required planning, patience, and respect. There were no second chances built into this design. When he finally turned back toward base, the reality settled in. The MiG-25 was not impressive because it was refined. It was impressive because it was honest. It made no promises beyond its mission, and it fulfilled that mission without apology. Calder didn't know it yet, but by the time he landed, the war in Vietnam would look subtly different to him, not because of tactics or politics, but because he had glimpsed how another world thought about air power. And that understanding was only beginning. The landing nearly killed him. Calder had brought fighters back on one engine, with battle damage, through monsoon weather and hostile airspace. None of that prepared him for the MiG-25 at low speed. The Foxbat hated being slow. Every aerodynamic compromise that made it supreme at altitude turned against the pilot in the pattern. The wings generated lift grudgingly. The controls grew heavy and imprecise, and the margin between flying and falling felt razor-thin. "Easy, easy," Calder muttered, easing the nose down. The aircraft crossed the threshold fast, too fast by American standards. But there was no alternative. Bleed off speed too aggressively, and the MiG would drop like a thrown anvil. The main gear hit hard, the structure absorbing impact with brutal honesty. No finesse, no apology. The jet rolled out in a long, smoking roar before finally slowing. When the canopy opened, Calder sat still for several seconds, hands resting on the stick, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. The smell inside the cockpit was sharp, hot steel, fuel, and something faintly electrical. This machine had not been designed for pilot comfort or error. It had been designed to survive speed. The debriefing room was full before he arrived. Engineers, intelligence officers, aerodynamicists, men who normally argued in separate buildings now crowded around a single table. Calder spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He described the climb, the stability at extreme speed, the terrifying fuel consumption, and the unforgiving landing characteristics. He emphasized what mattered most. "This aircraft doesn't exist to fight," he said. "It exists to interrupt." An analyst frowned. "Interrupt what exactly?" "Assumptions," Calder replied. "That altitude equals safety. That speed equals escape." The Foxbat challenges both. Slides followed. Structural diagrams revealed something startling. The MiG-25 wasn't built from advanced composites or exotic alloys as many had feared. It was mostly stainless steel, heavy and heat-tolerant, welded and riveted in ways Western engineers considered obsolete. They traded weight for temperature tolerance, one engineer said in disbelief. That's crude. Calder shook his head. It's deliberate. Titanium is expensive. Composites are fragile. Steel you can make anywhere, repair anywhere. They didn't need elegance. They needed something that wouldn't melt. The radar system drew similar reactions. Powerful, yes, but narrow in function. Designed to look up, not down. Optimized for large targets. Bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, anything that assumed invisibility through altitude. This wasn't built for Vietnam alone, an intelligence officer said quietly. This was built for the next war. Calder agreed. The MiG-25 felt less like a response to American fighters and more like a response to American philosophy. The U.S. believed in flexible platforms, multi-role aircraft, technological superiority through complexity. The Soviets, it seemed, believed in specialization taken to its extreme. In the weeks that followed, Calder flew the Foxbat repeatedly. Each sortie confirmed the same truth. The aircraft was nearly useless in a traditional dogfight. Below certain speeds, it became dangerous even to its own pilot. But above 60,000 feet, at velocities that turned aluminum soft, it was untouchable. Simulated intercepts told the real story. Against a theoretical State Route 71 profile, the MiG-25 could not guarantee a kill, but it could force evasive action. That alone was revolutionary. Strategic aircraft relied on predictability. The Foxbat injected doubt. And doubt, Calder realized, was a weapon. He began to think back to Vietnam, to the endless cycles of adaptation. The Americans brought higher altitude bombing. The North Vietnamese brought better SAM coordination. The Americans brought electronic warfare. The North Vietnamese adapted again. War in the air had become a conversation of counters. The MiG-25 wasn't a reply spoken loudly. It was a sentence that ended the argument. One evening, alone in his office, Calder reviewed reconnaissance reports from Southeast Asia. The Foxbat had not flown there in large numbers, but its shadow loomed regardless. American planners had adjusted routes, altitudes, and escort profiles based on the mere possibility of its presence. It changes behavior without firing a shot, Calder recorded. That's power. When his final report reached Washington, reactions were mixed. Some dismissed the aircraft as a one-trick pony. Others were unsettled by what that one trick represented. The MiG-25 did not threaten American air superiority directly, but it threatened the assumptions that superiority rested on. A general called Calder personally. "Colonel, your assessment is provocative," the general said. "Are you suggesting we're vulnerable?" Calder chose honesty. "Sir, I'm suggesting that superiority isn't static. We assumed speed and altitude were solved problems. The Soviets disagreed and built something to prove it." There was a pause on the line. "We'll take it under advisement," the general said finally. The Foxbat was returned to its hangar, its existence buried under layers of classification. Officially, it had changed nothing. Unofficially, design bureaus across the country began asking uncomfortable questions. Why did American aircraft assume ideal conditions? Why did they rely so heavily on systems that required perfection to function? What happened when the enemy designed for imperfection instead? Calder watched from the sidelines as the war in Vietnam wound down. He saw familiar patterns repeat, technology outpacing doctrine, doctrine lagging behind reality. And he knew that somewhere, in a Soviet design office, someone had understood something deeply uncomfortable long before the West had. The MiG-25 was not elegant. It was not efficient. It was not even versatile. But it was enough. And in war, Calder had learned, enough could be more dangerous than brilliance. The final lesson was still ahead of him. The lesson arrived quietly, years after the last bombs fell over Vietnam. By the late 1970s, Calder had moved into an advisory role, briefing younger pilots and engineers who had grown up hearing myths instead of radio calls. The MiG-25 evaluation was no longer classified at the highest levels, but it was still treated like an uncomfortable footnote, something acknowledged, rarely discussed. Then the doctrine began to shift. At a closed symposium on future air combat, Calder listened as designers debated agility, sensors, digital fly-by-wire systems, and information dominance. Slides showed elegant aircraft bristling with capability. When the floor opened for comment, Calder stood. "You're still designing for control," he said. The Foxbat was designed for denial. Some in the room bristled. Others leaned forward. He explained what had taken him years to fully articulate. The MiG-25 was not meant to win engagements in the traditional sense. It was meant to invalidate advantages the enemy believed were absolute. It forced change without needing perfection. It accepted its own limitations openly and built power around them. In Vietnam, Calder said, "We learned how dangerous it is to assume the enemy will play the same game." The MiG-25 wasn't playing dogfights. It was playing geography and physics. The conversation that followed was tense but transformative. Younger engineers asked different questions afterward, not how to dominate every scenario, but how to survive the worst ones. How to function when runways were damaged, when maintenance crews were exhausted, when systems failed. Calder recognized echoes of the Foxbat's philosophy in projects that followed. Aircraft that accepted trade-offs instead of hiding them. Designs that valued reliability and adaptability over elegance. The ideas weren't copied, but they were acknowledged. Years later, Calder visited an aviation museum on a quiet weekday afternoon. The MiG-25 sat near the back, its massive intakes casting shadows on the polished floor. Children walked past it toward sleeker, more famous aircraft. Few stopped. He did. The stainless steel skin bore heat scars and patch seams. This machine had never been meant to age gracefully. It had been meant to arrive early, act decisively, and leave fast. Standing before it, Calder felt the same unease he had felt years ago on the runway. Not fear, but respect. A docent approached. "Most people don't realize how controversial that aircraft was," she said. Calder smiled faintly. "Most people don't realize what it forced us to rethink." He thought back to Vietnam, to pilots trusting altitude, to planners trusting complexity, to wars measured in tonnage and sorties. The Foxbat had been a reminder that war did not reward the most beautiful ideas. It rewarded the ones that survived friction. Before leaving, Calder wrote a short note in the museum's guest book. "Power isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about making victory uncertain for the other side." Decades later, historians would describe the MiG-25 as misunderstood. Too heavy, too specialized, too extreme. Calder knew better. It had done exactly what it was built to do: expose assumptions. The Vietnam War ended without a clear technological victor. But in the quiet aftermath, lessons endured. Among them was one the Foxbat had etched into steel and heat. Speed can replace finesse. Simplicity can outlast complexity. And denial can be as powerful as dominance. As Calder stepped outside into the sunlight, he glanced once more at the hulking interceptor behind the glass. It was no longer a threat, no longer a secret. But its message remained. In the long contest between perfection and survival, survival always gets the last word.